Hi, everyone. Thank you to the two organizers of the symposium, as well as to CARTA and to the host, Salk, and all of you for being here. It's a pleasure to talk about the title here, which is about the genetic history of humans, and a little teaser on some animal history in South Asia as well. Before I jump into the stories I have for you today, I want to take several steps back. So when people in the field, whether it's ancient DNA or particularly paleoanthropologists and archaeologists, think about sort of the out of Africa movement that many of the previous speakers have alluded to, there's a lot of debate still ongoing about which particular routes have been taken and how did sort of humans leave Africa, where did they exit first, where did they meet the Neanderthals. Some of these models have been today, particularly with the help of ancient DNA data, been sort of put to rest, but still there is certain debate between several competing models, and that's topic for a completely different talk. But the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because there's one region that stands out as being fairly central to many of these competing hypotheses, which is South Asia. South Asia also happens to be today home to about a quarter of the global population and one of the most densely populated regions of the world. And so what sustains all these people today is this diversity, just magnificent diversity in ecozones, which essentially combines vegetation, ecotypes, and just geographic diversity. So you have anything from sort of different diverse zones of vegetation to the towering Himalayas, which really shapes the border, the periphery of South Asia to the north. And what comes with this huge population load is also diversity in just the culture and the traits. And so one proxy I've put up here is languages. And what you can see here is 4 major language families are spoken in South Asia. Indo-European languages, which happen to be the largest language family in the world. And part of those languages are spoken in particularly to the north part of South Asia. Dravidian languages, which are unique to South Asia. Tibetan Burman, which are spoken off to the east. Those are shared with many East Asian languages. They are an offshoot or sort of a branch of the larger Sino-Tibetan languages. And finally, Austroasiatic languages, which are also shared with many Southeast Asian languages. So when we now jump to the genetics, so I'm just going to first start out by showing you a plot, which we're all very familiar with now. It's a PCA. So this is just data from modern South Asians. And what we have here, anchoring sort of the axes, are West Eurasians, generally European populations, and East Eurasians, who are in this case East Asian populations from China. So these are sort of our 2 anchors. And what we observe here is everything else. So all these circles are all sort of genotype data from single individuals. So all of this cluster right here, all the colorful circles are all modern South Asians. And what you see here is across the 2 largest variation axes, PC1 and PC2, you see that South Asians sort of just lie intermediate to this immense kind of ends of the Eurasian diversity axes, right? Furthermore, here what I've done is I've colored individuals on these plots by the languages that they speak, and kind of stands out that populations who speak the same sort of language families tend to also cluster, generally speaking, according to their genotypes or their genetic ancestries here, which also underscores something that Johannes brought up, that perhaps a lot of cultural, particularly language associations, go hand in hand with human ancestry, the way we sort of moved around and mixed. Okay, so we've kind of established this. There's a lot of diversity here in terms of genetics, potentially cultural traits. So what underlies all of this? So what do we do when we look in the past? What do we see? So there's data to suggest, and the data is on this map. There's these represent currently securely dated sites from where we have data that evidences occupation in South Asia over the last 2 million years or so. So we have the Lower Paleolithic, which is sort of the early phase of the Stone Age or the Paleolithic. We have data that there's human activity, or sort of activity from human groups. Then even during the Middle Paleolithic, so kind of spanning the last sort of million years or so, all the way into kind of 400-ish thousand years. There's also data to suggest there's human groups present and active. And another sort of marker event has been this Toba supervolcano, which is a volcano in Indonesia, which sort of went off at 74,000 years. We have a pretty good geological time frame for this. And it was one of these massive explosion events. I don't know, many of you remember the big Iceland volcano that grounded all the flights and kind of, so this was sort of probably even more magnified, and there's speculation that it did a number of many human populations and sort of just general biodiversity around. But in South Asia, it's been interesting because there's activity and there's data to suggest that there is human or sort of some kind of human activity both before and after this Toba volcano, and that suggests that there's sort of continuity of humans. It wasn't sort of that the volcano ash kind of came and killed off any sort of activity and then, there was repeopling. At least it suggests that they were hanging out there and the volcano didn't have a huge impact. So I've been saying so far very cheekily, data. So what is this data I've been talking about? Well, so all of this data that sort of evidences presence of humans here in South Asia so far comes from primarily stone tools. So the lower Paleolithic, middle Paleolithic, we have fairly sort of rich and growing evidence of human forms. However, not as much fossil evidence. There's only one fossil, which, again, we don't know the identity of. Could be Homo erectus, could be a Denisovan, could be Homo neanderthalis. We have no idea, and that comes from one site in the Narmada Valley called Hatnora. That's it. And so when you look at stone tools, well, you can't really tell who made them. So until about 74,000 years ago, we know this activity, we know there's human groups, we don't know the identity of these humans. Okay, so fast forward to about 40,000 years. That's when archaeologists start picking up this microlithic culture, which is basically very kind of fine points, essentially sort of things you can hack onto the end of spears and really, go hunting with great precision. And this is a hallmark of modern humans. So this is the first direct evidence we have that modern humans have arrived in South Asia and are making it big. And to go with this, finally, we start getting some fossil evidence. So we have human remains that are dated about 38,000 that come from Sri Lanka. But that's pretty much it, again. So we are pretty low on the availability of fossil evidence from South Asia that can really anchor our understanding of the deep past. And so what do you do when you don't have too many fossils? You look and you excavate for modern genomes. And so that's what people have been doing. And as recent as a few months ago, there was a paper out of Priya Murjani's lab in Berkeley where they looked at over 2,700 modern Indian populations from all over the country. And they basically asked a few questions. I mean, they asked several questions, but I'm only going to put up a couple of exciting results. So one of the questions they asked was about this Toba supervolcano. Well, there was this continuity scene. So some archaeologists have speculated whether this could mean that modern humans were there and persisting already. Now, the bane of being one of the last speakers is that the previous speakers kind of steal the thunder. So we now know that it's not possible, given Janet's talk and Johannes' talk, that they were modern humans, at least the ones that gave rise to modern diversity were present at 74,000 years ago, but that's also what they see. So here they're looking at the coalescence time, or the last sort of time when non-African and African populations shared last common ancestor. And we can see across the board, so different colors of different regions of the world, this is South Asians. And you can see qualitatively, at least, there's really no significant difference in the sort of split times of populations from South Asia from African populations compared to the rest. And for reference, this is the Toba timeline, 74,000 years ago. So again, if this was a depopulation, we don't see any evidence of that from at least the genomes of the people who are living there today. The second staggering result from the paper was that they also looked at, or kind of excavated out, the Neanderthal and Denisovan sequences from these modern Indian populations. And what they found is that, again, it's the blue pies are the Indian populations, and both for Neanderthal and Denisovan sequences, there's a pretty high percent of region-unique sequences that can be ascribed to these archaic introgression events. And even more interesting is about 98% of the global Neanderthal sequences are found in Indian populations. And one could speculate what this means. I mean, one possibility is that perhaps South Asia was one of the first places where humans arrived right after the admixture, which means they retain a lot of that, the early admixture signal. They also don't see any evidence of unknown archaic ancestry, but obviously there's still much to be done here, and we don't know the archaic landscape at all of humans, given we don't have fossil evidence. So there's still a lot to learn from for the deep ancestry of South Asians that hopefully in the next few years there'll be more light shed on this. So we come to more recent times, and that's where we start picking up a little bit more from ancient DNA. This is also a dynamic period, much like in the rest of Eurasia, as we saw. In South Asia as well, you have a lot of reported prehistoric and historic migrations. Unfortunately, still, as much as I would like to say that young periods mean more ancient DNA, this is where South Asia stands as of a few years ago, and not much has changed. And one big reason for this is we're in the tropics. The preservation environments are not conducive to long-term preservation, so we don't have these massive sort of, site level ancient DNA data sets as we do from Europe. Yet we persist, and so one story I want to tell you is about this particular part of the PCA plot that we saw, where you see this sort of what you call a genetic decline of populations in South Asia who speak Indo-European, who you can see are closer to West Eurasian populations compared to the Dravidian speakers who are further south. In 2009, David Reich's group sort of constructed these statistical groups. So these are ghost populations, so we don't have any DNA data from these ancient groups, but they call them ancestral North Indians to represent sort of this ancestry that tags the one end that's closer to European populations, and ancestral South Indians that sort of pull at the other end. But we don't really have any data for these were ghost populations. But fast forward about 10 years later, there's been data now from particularly from the site of Rakhigarhi, which is affiliated to the Indus Valley or the Harappan civilization, one of the biggest Bronze Age civilizations out of South Asia. And that, together with many other ancient genomes from across Iran, Turan, and West Asia, they could model a single genome that was all that worked, in this case, from the site of Rakhigarhi, which is about 4,500 years old, as comprising of two components. One majority component, which is orange here, which is shared with ancient Iranian populations, but these Iranian populations are kind of all over the place. Some, the ancient hunter-gatherers, ancient herders, as well as ancient farmers from Iran have this kind of ancestry. And the next component is this tiny sliver of pink. And this pink represents an ancient hunter-gatherer. Again, we don't have any data for hunter-gatherers from South Asia. So currently the best proxy for them, though very distant still genetically, are the Andamanese. And so based on this, what they could see is that this particular ancestry type does contribute a lot to many, many modern populations, particularly the ones on that cline that I'd highlighted. But one thing they found is that when they timed the genetic admixture of this Iranian-like component and the Andamanese-like, it's sort of younger than the first recorded agriculture that we know of in South Asia, which comes from a site in Pakistan called Mehergar. And so unlike what we see in Europe, where this is mass migration of Anatolian farmers who go and really kind of infuse their genetic ancestry, perhaps that's not the kind of situation in South Asia. Maybe there's local agriculture kind of building up that may perhaps be getting pulses from the West, but again, based on a single genome, you can't say. But what they could tell is 4,500 years ago, there were two components. And then about 1,000 years later, there comes a third component. What is this? This is the steppe migration. So very analogous to what's happening in the rest of Eurasia. South Asia also gets this mass migration particularly from the Middle and Bronze Age steppe groups that come in and give an extra component to particularly populations in the northern part. And these happen to be populations that are today speakers of Indo-European languages, which are obviously shared with the rest of West Eurasia. So these steppe pastoralists to India also brought, again, languages, but also potentially traits like lactase persistence. So again, these were pastoralist groups, and we do see a tight association with higher steppe ancestry and the ability to digest lactose in South Asia as well. In a paper we recently did where we integrated some modern genomes from Sri Lanka to kind of expand our understanding of what's happening further south. What we could again do is, these are the same kinds of these pie models. So we have the three sources contributing to South Asian populations. And we see that even to the southern part, these are all Dravidian, kind of the homeland of Dravidian speakers today. What we see that even the most sort of indigenous populations who today practice hunting and gathering, even they have a large proportion of West Eurasian ancestry through this Indus Iranian sort of component. But the steppe ancestry, which here is in yellow, is predominantly still to the northern parts. So that's all I'll say about that. And I'm going to now jump to another language family and try to kind of track a little bit of what's happening there. So these are the Tibetan Burman speakers of India. Again, you can see them plotting closer to East Asian populations. This is the spread of Tibetan Burman languages spoken today across East Eurasia. India and sort of the Himalayan arc today has one of the highest diversity of Tibetan Burman languages spoken, to the extent that some linguists speculate whether this may have been the homeland, but that's a minority thought today. So a few years ago, we collaborated with Indian archaeologists and geneticists, and we tried to track sort of the northern end of this Tibeto-Burman sort of distribution. And what we found by sequencing several ancient samples over the past 1,300 years is that the majority ancestry in these populations in the north of sort of the Himalayan arc, but on the Indian side, is still predominantly Tibetan, but a small percent comes from the steppe. So again, there's sort of always this interaction with the rest of Eurasia that goes on, but this predominant steppe ancestry that we see in the Indian side of the Himalayas, which is Tibetan, continues to modern populations. So we see this sort of, if we collapse this into a pink ancestry, that's the northern Indian Himalayas, we see that in modern populations who live there today as well. And more importantly, what we see is that these populations in the northern Himalayas and India also have this particular EPAS1 variant, which has been inherited by the Tibetans from Denisovans, which give them the ability to survive in hypoxic environments. So this targets the EPAS1 gene, which is a hypoxia response gene, and this sits particularly of interest on the sort of the Denisovan match haplotype. And so these people on the Indian side are also getting this adaptation and this introgressive adaptation via the Tibetan ancestry. And here are some photos of us interacting and bringing results back to the very excited participants here. And the last thing I would say, because I'm almost at time, is I'm going to give you a super brief teaser. So when we were at the high altitude, we got very intrigued by these super cute animals called the yaks. These are very hairy, very central to the economy of the high altitude. They're present today across the Tibetan Plateau in the Indian Himalayas, but their natural range in the past also extended to Central Asia, possibly southern Siberia. We collected samples, actually along with Christina and Chun Wang, from across the Indian side, Nepal, as well as in Central Asia and Tajikistan. And what we're seeing, again, a super small teaser of ongoing work, is that here are all the modern and ancient domestic yaks. Here are the wild. And we have samples from the Indian side of the Himalayas that are about 9,000 years old, which predate the currently dated divergence between the domestic and wild yaks, and they sit right in the middle, where you would either expect populations that are admixed or ancestral. And so we're still doing a lot of checks and balances to see whether we have something that's ancestral to the domestication process that would help us understand the domestication history of this animal and also the adaptive history. So to summarize, the deep prehistory of South Asia still needs work, and particularly the interactions with these unique archaic species. Present-day South Asians derive ancestry from local hunter-gatherers, who again are a mysterious population today. But there's been a lot of migrations and interactions with the rest of Eurasia, and many of these interactions have brought in cultural and genetic novelty to the region. And finally, we also have a rich record of human-animal dynamics in this region that needs to be further explored. With that, thank you to all my collaborators, funding agencies, and to all of you.